are to discuss the issues we'll be raising is our Hesham Alghannam, who's a senior research fellow and program director of the International Studies Program at the Gulf Research Center. Adnan Al-Kurd, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Richmond and a non-resident scholar at MEI, Middle East Institute. Aaron David Miller, my colleague, and who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who focuses mainly on U.S. foreign policy, but is also a very old hand in Middle East politics. And Ahmed Naji, who's a non-resident scholar, also my colleague at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and his research focuses mainly on Yemen. Now, after 18 months in office, US President Joe Biden will be making his first trip to the Middle East. This trip originally began with an invitation from the Israeli Prime Minister. It comes in the midst of ongoing negotiations to revive the nuclear deal with Iran, negotiations that seem to be on the road to nowhere, as we saw from the last meeting in Doha. But this is also at a time when Washington's regional allies consider Iranian behavior a threat to their interests. But we're also, even in this, as they consider it a threat to their interests, we're seeing a lot of bilateral discussions underway, especially with Iran and facilitated mostly by Iraq. This trip also comes at a time when the conflict in Ukraine has led to a sharp increase in energy prices and global inflation and a looming recession. We just don't know how deep that recession will be. So in a sense, it's a critical juncture, both for the region, but also, I would say, at a global level. So the trip to the visit to Israel will also be taking place several weeks after the collapse of the Bennett government, and also amid deepening Israeli-Palestinian distrust when the US is being perceived as withdrawing from the region. So it's a critical juncture. Aaron, let me begin with you and ask you kind of a broad question in context. Over the past few months, you've been writing extensively about the potential of a visit by the US President Joe Biden to the Middle East. Why is this visit happening now? And is it signaling a shift in US foreign policy priorities, particularly away from the human rights-centric campaign promises?
Yeah, it's a critical question. First of all, let me thank the center, Maha and Josiane, for organizing this. And I'm really delighted and honored to be here with Ahmed, Dana, and Hesham. Look, I think on balance, if I had to provide one overriding judgment on why now, I think to some degree it's a question of virtue signaling. The Biden administration preoccupied with domestic politics, and it will remain so. I guess if the president were on the call with us right now, he would see that the greatest challenge we face is us. And preoccupied with a foreign policy dominated by Russia and Ukraine and China and a rising China, there is a strong constituency in the administration that believed it was extremely important to demonstrate that the administration had not totally forgotten about the Middle East. And while America is not withdrawing from this region, it clearly is deprioritizing it in respect to its domestic and other foreign policy challenges. And I think this trip was meant, to some degree, to counter that perception. Maha, as you pointed out quite rightly, the trip did not begin with the notion of a visit to Israel and the Arab states. It flowed essentially from an invitation in April on a phone call between then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the president. The president agreed to come. Why wouldn't he? Joe Biden's support for Israel, both emotionally and politically, is deep within his DNA. And he was not going to make the same mistake as his former boss, Barack Obama, by visiting the region in his first term, but only stopping in Egypt and not in Israel. And the fact that midterms are coming within several months had an added political benefit. However, let's be clear. I do not believe the breadth of this trip and the intensity around which it's now gathering would have occurred now had it not been for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For the president to go and sit with Mohammed bin Salman, I think he's terribly conflicted about this. He's basically intimated that in all of his public comments. He said repeatedly, I'm not going to Saudi Arabia to sit with MBS. He'll be there as a part of a broader meeting. I'm going for other reasons. But oil, I think, is clearly the sort of geopolitical strategic catalyst for the trip. Biden would not be undertaking a visit to Saudi Arabia in July of 2022 had it not been for the disruption of the oil market and the reality that Russia produced 1 out of every 10 barrels of crude. So the disruption between demand and supply, rising gas prices, all of this made the trip a bit more political, given prices at the pump, and strategic. Around the oil question, the administration has tried to wrap other American interests, resuming a functional relationship with Saudi Arabia, promoting the expansion of the Abraham Accords, maybe a Middle East regional air defense system with the Gulf, including Israel, may or may not be announced. And the prospect of moderate steps to enhance Israel's relations, Saudi Arabia's relations with the Israelis. One final point, I think Biden is traveling to a region which is long on problems and very short on solutions. What to do about the much too promised land, Palestine, how to lower oil prices, and of course Iran, which looms over the region as a whole. I also believe that there are growing doubts which remain about America's stability and its staying power. And there are at least 2 politicians, final point. One, a putative former prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who hopes to become prime minister again in November, and Mohammed bin Salman. Both of these leaders, in my judgment, are now looking past the Biden administration and looking very much forward to the return of one Donald Trump or his avatar. So I think it's a complex trip, and I think we should be extremely realistic about its expectations.
Thanks, Aaron. That's actually a great overview of this. And I will be coming back to quite a few of those themes, both in terms of internal domestic calculations around this trip, but also Israeli calculations around this trip. So I'll come back to some of these issues that you've raised. But Hesham, let me turn to you now and ask you about perceptions from Saudi Arabia. How is this? This is happening in the aftermath, as Aaron pointed out, repeated promises or statements by President Biden that he will not be meeting with the Crown Prince. It's a significant period of acrimony between the 2 countries, not least of which, one of the triggers obviously was the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So how is this trip being perceived in Saudi Arabia, and what does it say about Saudi-US relations?
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for having me. First, I think it's important to highlight that the visit in itself is a big deal, however you look at it. Despite some statements here and there, the main goal of the visit is clearly to fix the relationship with the Saudis and to meet with King Salman and the Crown Prince. And of course, from the Saudi side, it's not a Saudi interest to establish a norm of having an American president that do not visit the kingdom, nor is it also a Saudi interest to be part of any U.S. internal political conflict or side with one party against another. The U.S. Remains the main global power and the most important partner for the kingdom, and will remain so in the foreseeable future, despite all the differences and the disagreements between the two. And to my knowledge, serious work is going on right now to hammer out the deliverables for the visit across a range of issues, but mainly regional security being on top of the list, and also bilateral economic agreements. But the key issue, if you allow me, in my view, is what I can summarize in a single statement, will be managing these expectations and balancing the deliverables. Both sides will need to feel that they have received certain concessions on multiple issues, that they currently differ greatly on them. The visit itself is, and the meeting is, as I said, is important. It's a first step, an important step indeed. But other steps should be taken on Yemen, on Iran, on China, on oil, on the crisis in Europe, on assisting the kingdom in its vision and its different initiatives, on water scarcity and climate change, and the role of the kingdom, the Islamic world, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, just to name a few of these issues. Uh, some of this actually happened in the previous months and still happening, but much more is needed. And I think without a serious strategic dialogue at this important, as you said, Maha, juncture of time, without this, it will be difficult to do the necessary reset or recalibration, which I think until now, and after 2 years now, more than 2 years, means different things for different parties. But some sort of an alignment needs to happen in order to make this recalibration an institutional and one way or another, and produce a beneficial partnership for both. Personal relationships wasn't that helpful in the past between the two, and if I do not want to go into the blame game, but if you allow me, Maha, to reflect really briefly on what happened until now. I mean, since President Biden reached office, I think that the Saudi perception was, and despite what appeared to be positive steps from the Saudi side at the beginning toward the current U.S. administration at that time on different contentious issues, the American reaction indicated a lack of appreciation and respect, or at least this is how the Saudis saw it. I can give you an example, I think, which was a really game changer, and why relationships became deteriorated at that time. So there were these mixed signals coming from the U.S. The kingdom welcome, and I leave this to Ahmed, but they welcome Biden call to commitment to ending the war in Yemen. But the Houthis saw this as a weakness. And what was the response to the new security threats facing the kingdom, especially with the change in warfare that we're witnessing? There is an escalation in drones, low-cost missiles, the Houthi Iranian kamikaze drone attacks specifically. The Gulf, it's not only the Saudis, the Gulf, the Emiratis, were facing a qualitative escalation and risks. And America was getting also targeted in the region with almost no response. This was actually, I think, a serious red flag and a moment of reflection and a game changer for these states. Fixing this, I think, will require time and will require a clear plan. And I think this visit will initiate the process. But I think we need to be cautiously optimistic at this moment and wait until we see what could result from the visit initially. And I think a strategic dialogue will follow up later.
Thank you, Sam. So we're looking at this visit as a first step in a longer process that will at least map out, the future of U.S.-Saudi relations as you try and work them up. I'm going to come back to you with this question and specifically talk about what would Saudi Arabia need from President Biden at this point. But before I do that, let me turn to Ahmad and ask about Yemen. Because Yemen obviously is that will be one of the topics of discussion between President Biden and King Salman. So where do you see things going on that particular front, Ahmad?
First of all, let me say that I think it's very important to see Yemen as a key issue to be discussed during the summit between Biden and the GCC+3 summit. And I think this is, something very important to see, because usually we are dealing with, or we are seeing Yemen as an overlooked situation or marginalized situation. So to see Yemen as, one of the key priorities of Biden's visit is something important. But there is actually something, it's not, it's an unfortunate actually, which is which approach Biden is using to talk about Yemen, because giving the main purpose of the visit to Saudi Arabia, which its main objective is, the discussions over either the Saudi-U.S. relationship or the skyrocketing prices of energy. Yemen will be a secondary file during the discussions. And this is because of the nature, as I mentioned, of the discussion. And the second thing, because of Yemen can be seen from its, security dimensions and its impact on the region. The second thing is that Yemen will be discussed where everyone except Yemenis, the newly formed Presidential Leadership Council, which is backed by the Saudis, the Saudi-led coalition, and the U.S. The head of the PLC will not be there to discuss, the extension of the truce or the Yemeni situation. And this is actually an indication about, what can be done during the summit. Is it about Yemen, or is it about the impact of Yemen on the region? And another point related to the why Biden is putting Yemen as one of the key issues to be discussed with Saudi Arabia, and I think this is related to, the pressure coming from the human rights groups that talking about Yemen as, humanitarian catastrophe in the region and the needs for resolving this problem. And in order for Biden to send a message to these groups, he is putting Yemen as one of the key issues to be discussed.
Okay.
Again, when it comes to the truce that is going on in Yemen, I think the truce itself is not enough to resolve the problem in the country. It's going to freeze the conflict, but it's not, the ultimate objective to end the war. And by saying that, what we are seeing today is that there's some sort of talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. There's some talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran over Yemen. But what is needed is more focus on the local dimension of the conflict, because we can end the Houthi-Saudi conflict. But what is needed is a Yemen-centered strategy where we are bringing the local stability to be discussed and to be given more priority, because this is the only way to secure Yemen and the region as well.
We're going to come back again, like your co-panelists will come back to the issue of the Yemeni peace process, and I would like to ask you to talk a bit more about whether you see how can this visit, are there ways that this visit can positively impact the political process rather than just simply a ceasefire or a truce, as you've eloquently discussed. But I wanted to turn now to Dana. Dana, President Biden will be visiting both Israel and Palestine. Again, amidst significant regional tensions, but also significant domestic tensions between the PLO and Hamas. At a time when normalization as a result of the Abraham Accord seems to be taking place across different parts of the region. So what role do you see the administration playing, and particularly the role of this visit? Both what kind of impact will it have on domestic policies within amongst Palestinians moving forward? Will it have an impact, and if yes, what kind of an impact will it have?
Yeah.
So level in a second. We'll come back to the regional level.
Sure. No worries. So I think similar to the previous co-panelist that spoke on Yemen, I think Palestine is not a priority of this administration or of this visit. There is, as you said, a visit, but already there's a lot of discussion of how Palestinian leadership is not is quite disappointed in the Biden administration thus far, and Palestinian society is quite disappointed, growing in its kind of frustration with American intervention. Now, to be clear, American intervention has never been pro-Palestinian, or even really, a neutral kind of mediation. But I think, especially after the Trump administration's big shifts in American foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine, there was maybe a little bit of expectation that some of these things might be reversed, or certain steps would be taken to correct for some of the things that happened under the Trump administration. But this has not happened. The Biden administration has been very unwilling to engage on any of those issues that were sticking points for the Palestinian leadership. And in terms of, as I said, Palestinian society, there is just complete loss of credibility amongst Palestinians. So in the latest polling that we have from Palestine, when asked, Palestinian respondents were asked what country poses the biggest risk to the region, and 51% answered the United States, more than Israel. And Israel is its own occupier. So that gives you an indication of how Palestinians are viewing the American role. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the rest of the panel as well. But recent issues related to Shireen Abu Akleh's killing, and the American response, and all of these things has been quite angering towards for the Palestinians towards the United States. In terms of how Palestinians are viewing kind of increased normalization, there is obviously also a growing frustration there, because they're being sidelined in supposedly these peace agreements that are about ending the Arab-Israeli conflict, without actually addressing the root cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is the fact that the Palestinians have not been allowed to have self-determination. And so they have been, their final kind of what's the word, like bargaining chip vis-a-vis the Arab Peace Initiative has been destroyed, and there's all these kind of bilateral moves towards either behind the scenes normalization, or just official normalization, as we saw with the UAE and Bahrain. So that is also quite, frustrating for Palestinians, and this is, in the long term, very dangerous, because not only are Palestinians kind of completely over the Oslo Accords, especially young people. They want to scrap the whole peace process, which I think is legitimate. But there is more of a turn to armed resistance, and amongst armed resistance, there is more of a turn to Iran, and so that is a really concerning, kind of step that I think American policymakers, because they think that they can kind of sideline the Palestinians or go around the Palestinians, don't really consider the ramifications of this kind of shift.
No, you're absolutely right, Dana, on this last point especially. We're already seeing Hamas repairing its relationship with Iran, with Syria's with Bashar al-Assad, but also getting closer to Hezbollah. Ismail Haniyeh was in Lebanon recently. So we're already seeing this kind of a reconstitution of the axis of resistance, if you like, in that sense, an attempt to strengthen it. But clearly, from what you're saying, Palestinians have very little expectations from this particular visit, or any sense that this will bring some needed relief in one way or the other, political relief I'm talking about. We'll come back to this in a second, because I also want to ask you, I want to talk a bit more about the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and how that has also impacted perceptions of the U.S. role. And if the U.S. role is eroded to that point, then what does that mean moving forward for the peace process? But before we get there, let me go back to Aaron and ask him about President Biden's visit to Israel proper. Aaron, this trip was issued by a sitting government. Now President Biden will be visiting a country where elections are about to happen. This is a caretaker government. You've written quite a bit about, and in your talks also, you've talked about the possibility that President Biden and this administration will try and favor Naftali Bennett over Bibi Netanyahu, who's looking to come back. Can you tell us a bit more about the internal dynamics of President Biden's visit to the U.S.?
On Washington's side or on the
both. We need both. I think we also, I mean, the question I asked earlier, which is about the domestic policy, domestic also reaction to this.
Right. Look, a presidential visit to Israel, no matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, is it's essentially taken for granted. It's deeply entrenched in American political realities. And in the case of Joe Biden, and the presidential model here, by the way, for Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. Presidential model for Biden is Clinton. Both are roughly, Biden's older, but they're clearly more of the same generation. Their views on Israel, I think, are much more similar, Clinton and Biden's. And I mentioned earlier that Biden's support for Israel is deeply entrenched in his political DNA. I mean, he's probably the only president, living president, that could basically say that he's met with every Israeli prime minister since Golda Meir. And unlike Obama, who is dealing with an extremely difficult Benjamin Netanyahu, I think Biden made a decision, and it's proven to be true over the past 18 months, that he had no interest in pushing the Israelis or engaging with them in public spats on two key issues. One is what to do about Iran, and the other is what to do about a very broken and very dysfunctional, non-existent, arguably, Israeli-Palestinian peace process. As you mentioned, Mahab, if you look at the Biden administration's behavior over the past 18 months, 16, 17 months, in dealing with the Bennett government, the prime directive here was to do nothing, absolutely nothing, that would roil Israel's political waters in an effort to open the door to what has now happened: a new election, collapse of the government, a curiously, very intriguing government, by the way, most short-lived government in Israel's history, although the average length of an Israeli government since independence is 1.9 years. And Biden did not push Bennett. In fact, he gave Bennett and Lapid, now Lapid and Bennett, incredible room to maneuver. Did not push them, certainly rhetorically, yes, but not even there, tough on settlements. Slow walked the reopening of the Jerusalem consulate, and that's still the case. Slow walking it, acquiesced in an extraordinarily I shouldn't say pro-Putin, but pro-Putin or pro-Russian policies on the part of the Israeli government, because they have equities in Syria and in Ukraine and Russian Jewry, didn't push them there. And I think that's clearly going to continue. Now that you have a caretaker government, which is not going to be able to take decisions. On the Israeli side, I think you now have, and Kissinger famously said, Israel has no foreign policy, just domestic politics. There's much truth to that. I think that the visit will, by definition, make Yair Lapid look prime ministerial, which is going to be a key campaign theme of his. He will, in fact, be prime minister for 4 months, perhaps even longer, given the results of the election. But again, final thought: Biden's unstated preference is clear. When he sits with Benjamin Netanyahu, as he will, because he's going to sit with the leader of the opposition, the bubbles above Biden's head and Netanyahu's, Biden's will say, "Gee, I hope you really don't return as prime minister." And Netanyahu's bubble will be, I hope the Republicans do extremely well in 2022, and that Trump or a Republican lookalike returns in 2024.
Well, having said that, Aaron, let's just take this to move to U.S. domestic policy and talk a bit about the domestic perception of this trip, both vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia as well as vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine.
Shibli Tolhami, I just noticed it before we got on, has a piece in the Washington Post. He conducted 2 polls on this visit. I think he concluded, I didn't have time to read it all. The only thing that I saw was only a quarter of the humans polled support this trip. And that part of the reason is because of the public perception of MBS in Saudi Arabia. In deference to respect to Shibli, I only caught those 2 points. So I don't know what his logic or reasoning was in analyzing the polls as to why so many Americans would be opposed or not supportive of Biden's trip. It may be the fact that people are looking at the price of gasoline, not so much at what happens in the Middle East. Look, for Biden, I think Biden's a manager when it comes to the Middle East, not a resolver. That's, I think, by definition, a function of the fact that one of the great changes in American foreign policy toward the Middle East over the past 20 years is the growing conviction that most of the problems that ail this troubled region are way, way, way beyond America's capacity to repair, even in conjunction with its allies. But Biden has 2 issues that I think he is focused on. And I'll be interested to hear Donna's view of this. I agree with just about everything she said about how the administration is looking at the Palestinian issue. But remember May 2021. And May 2021 was an unanticipated explosion from the standpoint of the administration, confrontation between Israel and Hamas, that threatened to put the president between a Republican Party that has established itself as the go-to party on Israel, the Israel right or wrong party, as opposed to a badly divided Democratic Party, where you have a progressive wing that is pushing Biden to do much more on the issue of Palestine and Israeli occupation policies, and a majority of Democrats who are more traditional, who are willing to criticize Israel, but not as vehemently as the progressives. And that is a very narrow line for Biden to walk. And he has to walk it when there's a confrontation with Israel. So he's trying to manage this so he doesn't get another repetition of May 2021. And then there's Iran, which is the one issue that threatens the administration's domestic priorities. A major confrontation between Israel and Iran that draws the U.S. in could lead to even higher gas prices and plunging markets. And we're already involved in one proxy war against Putin. So it'll be fascinating. One last point is the Mossad is being reported, has concluded in terms of their analysis that the prospects for a U.S.-Iranian agreement are actually quite high. And there will be a resumption of negotiations following the Biden visit. Having had discussions with my friend Rob Malley, I think there's a reason clearly to be skeptical about the status of those negotiations, but I literally would not rule out a return to the JCPOA in the months ahead.
This is the Middle East, Aaron, so anything and everything can happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, thank you for this. Let me just touch on one last point before I move to Hesham. In the context that you've described and this kind of increasing, a clear resistance to President Biden's trip to the U.S., domestic resistance. There's also pressure on the administration. There was, I think, a proposal on Capitol Hill. So there are lots of things happening domestically. What is it that President Biden can offer to Saudi Arabia today? And what is it that he wants specifically from them? And what is it that he can offer them?
Well, look, what are the issues on the table? And I think there are 4. One is, can the president induce Saudi Arabia as a member of OPEC Plus to ramp up production over time? That's number one. Saudis have indicated there's been some slight moves in that direction. The OPEC Plus agreement, I think, is up for renewal in September. Maybe the Saudis will decide to do more, but I think if we're not in a major recession, which will lower the price of gas and oil, I think you may see a bump in production toward the end of this year and early next. Not enough to benefit the administration in the midterms, to be sure. So check the box on oil, modest. Then you have the issue of Saudi-Israel. And the administration, I think, is using those issues to more or less push back on the human rights problem that Biden has with MBS. But I think there may be a modest announcement. Tom Nides, the Israeli ambassador, said the day before yesterday in a podcast with Haaretz that there will be no announcement on normalization on this trip. It doesn't mean there couldn't be modest steps that the Israelis and Saudis are prepared to announce. Then you have the security situation, both the bilateral security assurances to Saudi Arabia and the regional integration with the GCC, and finally, human rights. Frankly, I don't see much that is of political value or currency that the president could achieve on this trip that is going to benefit him politically at home. The human rights community, rightly in my judgment, the Washington Post and the media, and I learned in Washington 45 years ago, never ever go to war with the Washington Post if you can help it. Congress is not going to buy anything that is short of a major, I don't even know how to put this, a major change in Saudi Arabia's behavior on not just on Jamal Khashoggi, but on a variety of human rights abuses that continue to go on in the kingdom. So I don't see much utility politically. There is some value, if in fact there are modest steps taken to improve Israeli Saudi relations. But again, for a useful political currency for Biden on this trip, foreign policy currency maybe, but useful inside the Beltway currency, I see very little that benefit for Biden politically on this trip. Gas prices are not going to come down, and you're not going to see a sea change. I'd be interested in Hisham's view on this. Certainly in Saudi Arabia's human rights practices.
Yeah, that's interesting, Hesham. Let me turn to Aaron. Let me turn to you, Hesham, and say, what does Saudi Arabia need to address some of the issues Aaron has pointed out? What does it want? What does it expect? What does it need from the United States? Especially since, just to put it in a broader context, we saw Saudi Arabia, along with other longtime U.S. allies in the region, very hesitant over siding with the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this was very apparent in the voting in the UN Council, particularly the second and third vote. So in that broader context, do we see this turnaround? And if yes, what is needed to push it in that direction?
Oh, too many good questions. So I think what's important, and I'm talking about perceptions here. Using a Saudi lens, the view could be different using a different lens. But I think the Saudis, in the past few years, a soft handling of the Iranian matter, which resulted in the empowerment of Iran in the region at the expenses of the Saudis. To the disregard of the political and economic partnership with the kingdom, calling it a free rider sometimes, which I think is an exaggeration that is not supported by facts. And actually, I think that disagreements are not new between the two states. The only time there was an agreement between the two sides, I would make the claim, was with the liberation of Kuwait. Maybe that's why it was a successful and a quick operation. Cooperation during the Cold War and the fight against communism was not because the Saudis were acting as a client state and were following orders that came from the White House. It happened because there was a common interest for both. Following the same line of thought, interest could meet again. The US wants to, as Aaron mentioned, wants to lower its footprint in the region, and the Saudis are willing to work with that. And I think the success rate in cooperating with the US is higher between the US and the Saudis is higher than what other states with their Iron Dome have achieved until now. But the two main issues, and Aaron touched upon that, on the table now, I would say, if I filter these issues, we have twofold. The oil prices. The second is that the Saudis seem unwilling to accept any limits in their relations with other major powers, mainly China. I guess maybe they learn from their past mistakes. They're trying to, and this is related to your question, Maya, directly, try to develop their interest with everyone. It's also, there is this, the association, and we're seeing this also with this Hajj season. The kingdom association with the US for decades have caused too many issues for the Saudis. We have received attacks on our oil infrastructure, lost many of the soft power component that we had because of this alliance or partnership. And I think that the kingdom is still paying the price for its cooperation with the US from its security economy and soft power until the current moment. We see this also in the Iranian view of the kingdom. So the Saudis, it's not only the Saudis, also other Gulf states considers the US still as their main and first strategic partner. But I think sincerely that these states have matured. Their awareness of their interests have grown. They will not engage in conflicts with other great powers. We saw that the recent European events is a good example of that. And I don't think that the Saudis or other Gulfis were siding with Russia or with Putin. But it's the fact that the path of building confidence, easing tensions, dialogue should go hand in hand with building deterrence and defense capabilities and repairing aggressions. I think these are two complementary paths, not contradictory options. And if you want me to continue on the
I wanted to ask you what would Saudi Arabia like to get out of this trip?
As I said, I think some sort of an action plan, some sort of a guarantee to the kingdom's security, help with its different initiatives, cooperation, and other fields. It's not only secure. It's not only the oil. I think the oil equation, oil for security, does not exist anymore. We have other threats in the region, including climate change. And I could, I just want to clarify the Saudi position on Russia. I think this is important. Because I think we get this wrong. Yes, the kingdom, and I think the kingdom, when it voted in the UN General Assembly, as you mentioned, condemning Russia's invasion, this was a main Saudi interest. It goes against our interests because this will hurt us somewhere else. But it's not. Our position is not identical to the Western position. I think, and this is my opinion, the Saudi focus is not on destroying Russia, but stopping the war mainly. And I think that the Saudis had an issue with politicization of the financial system, trade and economy also. This will not help in ending the crisis, as we see, nor will Russia's expulsion from international organizations will do that. It only destroys the balance of supply and demand. And I think any additional sanctions will contribute to the rising prices and increase the market imbalances. I think it's a dangerous game, politicizing energy prices at the expenses of national interests. It's because, later on the Saudis and the Gulf will live with the consequences when the US Also, I mean, they see that the U.S. is abandoning their security and leaving the region for the so-called pivot to Asia. So why would someone expect that these states, these are not superpowers, not global powers, why wouldn't someone expect that they would try to at least uh, hedge their bets, try to have working relations with everyone. China is the main customer of the Gulf oil and the kingdom for the foreseeable and far future. Europe is not as I mean, China's relation with the Gulf seems very. It seems very important to risk it for and try to respond to Western demands in that regard. I think this is a very risky game that these states cannot. I mean, they cannot just engage in this global power competition or wars, as this will fire back on them very badly.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then maybe ask Aaron to respond before we move to Dana and Ahmad. Would Saudi Arabia be willing to leverage its relationship with Russia to try and end the conflict?
I think that they've been trying to do that, but from the beginning of the crisis. Yes, and there is no. I mean, there is no use in hiding that the Gulf states also benefited from the crisis. And the financial aspect of it, but also having inflation and a global recession is not in their interests. But if you allow me to also, if the U.S. is directing its strategic capabilities to focus in Asia, which is an understandable American strategic orientation. How can the kingdom or any other state in the region be blamed for its anticipating of the rise of a superpower such as China? I think meeting unreasonable demands to confront China could put the Saudis in a very difficult position, especially with their first. It's the most important customer that the kingdom has. Add to this that there is this perception in the whole region that the U.S., whether it's true or not, that the U.S. is abandoning the security of the region and disregarding the interests of its partners in the region, except for the Israelis. So, the two parties, the Saudis and the U.S., are keen in their relation, but I don't think this will prevent the Saudis from developing. And I want to say this in a good way, from developing their relationships with others. And no state would be a substitute for another state.
Okay. Thank you, Hesham. Aaron, let me turn to you and see if you want to respond to some of the things that Hesham brought up before we move to Dana and then to Ahmad again.
No, I'd only say that the notion that America is back has gone from one extreme, how the Biden administration fared in its withdrawal from Afghanistan, which caused people to wonder whether America would ever be able to lead again, to its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is probably, in my judgment, was the most adept alliance management that I've seen since the last most adept alliance management under Bush 41 and James Baker, for whom I had the honor and privilege of working. So America's back, but they say that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk. And the fact is, the question is, yeah, America's back, but for how long? The degree of our domestic dysfunction here, the stability of our political system, of which I have grave doubts, is going to be the strategic anchor, in my judgment, that determines how successful and active the United States will be able to be abroad. And governing is about choosing. A rising China is clearly the key priority. Longer term, Russia, in view of what's happened in Ukraine, is the imminent challenge. The Middle East, and I know Brett McGurk, I've talked to him about this. I had him on the show. I've asked him whether or not we're deprioritizing the Middle East. He paints a compelling picture. I agree that we're not withdrawing. But somewhere between transformation, which I think the American administration has abandoned, and extrication, which is withdrawal, somewhere between transformation and extrication is the balance that not only this administration, but future administrations will have to strike in dealing with a region, as I mentioned before, most of whose problems are beyond America's capacity to repair. So I think great caution is in order here in terms of expecting the United States on the key unresolved problems in the region. I'll only name two: what to do about Iran on one hand and what to do about Palestine on the other. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for our friends, allies, and partners, and we have three different sorts in the region: friends, allies, and partners, to want to continue to rely. So they're going to hedge their bets.
Yes.
When a former patron sends signals that it is going to be less patronly, then smaller powers adjust and readjust.
And we're seeing that.
That's what's happening. And now sometimes they're adjusting toward one another, which I would argue is a good sign. But on balance, I fear the real implication of an adjustment that leaves partners exposed and America handicapped in terms of trying to support them.
No, I agree, and it's also for the region. It can spell more and more instability, unfortunately, down the road. We'll come back to other issues in a second, but let me turn to Dana now and ask you, Dana, first. The killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. There was a report that came out of the State Department which said that the bullet is too damaged to determine whether it was an Israeli soldier that fired or somewhere else. What are the expectations on this particular file from the perspective of Palestinians? Will this be an issue of discussion during this visit? If not, then what are there any expectations on this particular issue, especially since Shireen was a dual citizen?
Yeah, so I think Shireen's murder is like a very good case study of how the Americans behave towards Palestinians and towards the region. So Shireen was murdered. There were live witnesses. There were many investigations, Al Jazeera being one of them, but also B'Tselem, also Amnesty, like lots of different organizations have come to the same conclusion that this was targeted, that there weren't any other armed militants, all of these things. And the State Department put out basically a statement that provides cover for the Israeli government in terms of its accountability towards what happened, saying that they can't, it probably came from the Israeli soldiers, but this was a tragic accident. And what the family has said is that given that Shireen is a dual citizen, this is unacceptable. I mean, it's unacceptable for many reasons, but especially that she's an American, that they would want or would expect the FBI to engage in an investigation, as they often do for American citizens killed abroad, and that they want to they're still asking for an American investigation that's kind of free of these kind of political considerations, but they also want to take it to the ICC. They want to escalate the situation because this is an unacceptable outcome that nobody is held to account for her killing. And I think that, as I said earlier, and kind of to piggyback on the previous conversation, that Shireen's killing is very emblematic of how the Americans have been conducting themselves in the region, because they, as has already been kind of alluded to, like Biden and the Biden administration has a certain incentive structure. They don't want to rock the boat. They just want to manage. And in the future, the Americans will not withdraw, but not seek transformation. But the thing that kind of confuses is that, one, nobody wants the Americans to resolve everything. But the Americans had such a heavy thumb on the scales that just to stop being an obstacle to change would be enough for a lot of people. So not to obfuscate the many investigations that have come out regarding Shireen's killing, that would have been a step. Not just simply not to obfuscate. In terms of other things as well, I understand, as I said, that the Biden administration doesn't have any incentives to take hard steps, but also their time is limited. Everybody knows that. So it's like, I think that this is just basically what I'm trying to say is, I think the Biden administration has proven that it doesn't really have the appetite or the will to do any kind of take any hard steps, whether domestically or internationally. But I think that this is a really grave error, because either they can take hard steps or allow things to continue to fester and suffer the blowback in the coming years. Because you can't disengage from the Middle East. Your struggles with Russia and China and the erosion of democracies in the West, the MENA region plays a key role in that. It's not just related to oil. And as I said, nobody wants the Americans to resolve everything. We just want the Americans to take a step back from the things that they've messed up. At least don't be an obstacle in an attempt to solve things. So on the Palestinian side, propping up the PA, providing cover for Israeli transgressions, that's acting as an obstacle. In the regional side, encouraging these normalization agreements that don't get at the root of the problem, which are really a form, not really, I don't think of them as peace agreements. I think of them as authoritarian conflict management. This is acting as an obstacle. And the festering that I'm talking about is what led to what happened last May, because it wasn't just a confrontation between Hamas and Israel. It was an upheaval. We saw protests in Lid and in Al-Fahm. We saw protests amongst Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And I think the Americans haven't understood yet that there is a huge bifurcation between the political leaders that you think you can sideline and the mass public. And they think that they don't have to consider the public. But this is, again, I'm just kind of keeping a broken record. This is a losing strategy. It will have explosive results, and festering is not going to be in American interest or in the region's interest in the future.
Thank you, Dana. And this is happening in a context actually of increasing fragility and vulnerability across the region, not just in Palestine, with the food security crisis, increasing poverty, etc., which means the whole region is not heading in a good direction. Anyway, let me turn to you, Ahmad, now. Also, recently the US administration lifted Ansarullah. They revoked the terrorist designation from Ansarullah, or the Houthi movement. So my question to you is, how do you see this impacting the peace process? And what are your hopes? I mean, what is it that you think can be brought to the table? How can the US administration better impact a possible resolution to the conflict in Yemen?
First of all, Maha, just allow me actually to comment on what Aaron and Hesham mentioned.
Of course.
Aaron mentioned, the 4 points that are very important for the US, and I think this is adding to what Hesham mentioned. I think the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia, as well as China, is something very important, because for Saudi Arabia, the enemy of my friends is not my enemy, and this is something that very clear for the new Saudi strategy in dealing with major powers, because the Saudis, as well as the Emiratis, don't want to get involved with any sort of global divisions. And I think this is because of the previous incidents happened in the region, one of which is the attacks happened in both the UAE and Saudi Arabia early this year. And for Saudis, there was some sort of expectation that the US would act differently towards this kind of attacks. But in fact, what happened was totally different. We have seen from the US side the suspension of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. the delays in supplying interceptors to Saudi Arabia. And for Saudis, this is something, I mean, not good for the relationship with the US. And the second point is that we are seeing Saudi Arabia is acting in resolving its issues alone without expectation or without expecting any sort of collaboration coming from the US. For example, in the last truce, there's so many channels through which the Saudis counted on, some of which is dealing with, the Houthis directly through the Omanis, and the other channel uh, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the third channel is directly between Saudis and Hezbollah, for example. And this is can tell us or can give us an indication about how Saudis are more counting on their capabilities more than the US assistance. Coming back to your question, Maha, I think
Sorry, but we heard just on this issue of Hezbollah specifically. I mean, one news
yes,
item was indicating we heard that they actually played a role in getting this process in place.
they are playing a role in supporting the Houthis, and in terms of the truce, they are playing the role actually to negotiate on behalf of the Houthis, and this is actually another dimension of how the different conflicts in the region are either triggered or resolved. But I mean, coming back to your question, Maha, I think the problem of the U.S. policy towards Yemen is that they look at Yemen from two different lenses. The first one is the security lens, and what they see in Yemen is just Al Qaeda, nothing else. 10,000 Al Qaeda members, and this is Yemen for them. And their policies have been shaped always by counter-terrorism military campaign, and they always assess the Yemeni parties through this a security approach, unfortunately. And this, on the short term, can help them to target some tourist groups, but on the long term, it will undermine local stability in Yemen. And the second lens of the US is that they look at Yemen from the regional power, so from the regional perspective. So how Yemen is affecting Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE, this is actually what matters most for the US. And I think both are not bringing any sort of really stability to the country. So when Biden came to the office at the beginning, he mentioned that we need to end the war in Yemen, but he didn't mention how, or at least, I mean, the U.S. Special Envoy Tim Linderking, despite his great efforts he is doing actually with so many regional powers, he had no enough leverage on the Houthis. And from the Houthi side, they understood the Biden's statement mistakenly, because just 3 days after the Biden administration announced ending the war strategy in Yemen, the Houthis attacked Marib and took over many areas, either in Marib or Shabwa, which later on restored from them. But again, you don't have enough leverage on the Houthis so that you cannot make any sort of change. But again, with Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, I think there are three key elements that we can count on if we are talking about resolving the problem in Yemen. The first one is the shifting Saudi strategy, because we are seeing Saudi more keen to resolve the problem, to change its strategy inside the country. And I think this momentum should be used to take it one more step. And the second point is the current truce. Yeah, I mean, the current truce is using to, trigger some sort of talks between, I mean, on all levels, the local levels as well as the regional levels. And I think it can take us, if we invest in it in a good way, it can take us to, some sort of political compromises in the future. And the third point is the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because we are seeing, the humanitarian situation is getting worse in the country. And I think this is, a key factor that pushing all the warring parties to think about continuation of conflict and how the impact will be on the civilians if there is any sort of conflict continuation. So if we are using these kind of factors, I think we can take the situation to more, let's say, progressive step and start to open discussions with everyone and try to come up with real discussions about what should be done either on the regional or domestic levels.
Thank you, Ahmed. Actually, that's very comprehensive. Before I move to Hisham, I wanted to actually say to the audience out there watching us, please send any comments you have or any questions you may have to our panelists on the in the comments section of the whatever channel you're watching. Hisham, let me turn to you and ask. This is a question from the audience, but it was also a question I was planning to ask you, which is, what is Saudi public opinion? We've been hearing a lot of reports about increasing. I mean, we heard from Aaron and from others that there will not be an announcement on a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. However, we've been seeing different reports whether of increasing engagement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. One is vis-a-vis Egypt and the islands of the two islands. But the other is also, we heard about this agreement. It's not a Middle East NATO, but it's some sort of coordination, military coordination that seems to be coming together. So my question to you is, how does Saudi public opinion view this rapprochement with Israel?
Okay, so on the Israel issue, I cannot speak about the Saudi public opinion. I can speak about my opinion. I think many would say that it's a far. I mean, having a Saudi Abrahamic Accord would be a far possibility at the current moment. I mean, a fully comprehensive normalization. What could we have is some sort of a limited deal or an understanding on very specific issues, as the island issue you mentioned, Maha, the flight issue also. Again, we see theatrics here and there, but if we give it a deeper look, it seems still, I mean, the Arab initiatives or at least key components of it are still for the Saudis key to any normalization with the Israelis. And it seems also that this wouldn't be possible without some sort of a U.S. influence. Both the U.S. and Saudi wants to restart talks for the two-state solution that the Trump administration undermined. But I think that the peace, still for the Saudis, the Arab Peace Initiative provided at least a proposal to end the conflict through encouraging Arab states to recognize Israel as a state once an acceptable two-state solution for both the Israelis and Palestinians is reached. Now, in the Arab NATO or I have an elaborated interview that I speak about this, but in a nutshell, I would say that I think that the reports we're seeing and what we hear in the media many times and think tanks is exaggerated. There is no common target to have a new Arab NATO. I don't think that there is also that these states do not see a common enemy. I do not think that we will see a Middle Eastern NATO or a new MESA. I think there are practical steps from the bottom up, not the other way around. So we're seeing improvements, and that includes integrating and strengthening the capabilities of air and missile defense monitoring and coordination between the Gulf states themselves and also between them and the U.S. Central Command. But I do not see that an Arab NATO is a feasible idea at the current moment. During the Trump administration, this could have happened at that moment, but it seems that during that time there was this assumption that the Saudis will handle the financial burden of the whole alliance. That's why it failed, and also that the problems remained. That there are still, no common enemy, no common targets, no common
Not even Iran?
cultural background.
Not even Iran?
Well, if you take, it's a case specific. The Saudi Gulf, even among the Gulf states, it doesn't seem that there is this this alignment, which I think will prohibit any such project to fly. And if you add Jordan and Egypt to the matter, it gets more complicated. But what I think is the best way to do this is to that the Americans can do a lot in this matter. You need to talk to you need global powers, and also you need the big players in the region, specifically the Saudis, and also the rest of the Gulf states and the Turks. Generic and specific processes should be initiated, because every issue in the region has a different solution. It's not something that you can handle easily. It will require, breaking it into components and having a process of each. You cannot just put them in one basket and have a one-size-fits-all solution for every issue in this region.
Hesham, let me ask you, just because we brought up the issue of Iran, and you had talked earlier about the drone attacks in the UAE, but also in Saudi Arabia. What is it that you would like to see the US do in terms of containing, from the Saudi perspective, the threat of Iran vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia or the Gulf region or the broader region? What are the specific things you would like to see the US involved in? And perhaps tagging onto this, a question around the JCPOA. How do you think?
The main issues remain still, unchangeable. The point of view of these states, the Gulf states, specifically the Saudis, that you cannot just have a limited deal that would only delay the capability of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. And now you have also the Israelis escalating against Iran, which I think even the example of North Korea, Iran would not be capable of doing this. What we hope for is that a realization from the part of the Iranians that this idea of forward defense did not help them. Their militias in the region, their presence in these failed states across the region, especially the Fertile Crescent and Yemen, did not help them. What we want to see is you cannot just have carrots; you need to have sticks also. And Iran need to have a fundamental change in the way that they look at their neighbors, and also in the way that they build their capabilities. You cannot. We have no issues with Iran having its building its defense capabilities, but being present in other states in the region was very problematic for us. And even the meetings, and I think the meetings with the Iranians, between the Saudi and Iranians, was a Saudi decision. It wasn't something that the US pressured the Saudi to do. So we talk about these issues, Hajj, diplomats, Yemen, but it seems that Iran did not reach its limits yet. That it feels threatened in the region, and I'm not sure how to accommodate these threats. The regime itself has a problem and has a way in dealing with its own population. And I'm not sure how can someone expect to have a deal with such a regime and expect this deal to be sustainable or to lower the intensity or heat in the region. What we hope for is much is some sort of a pressure on Iran to stop its um, um, nuclear dreams. This is on one side, and the militia part. And I think this also can come with a package of incentives, an economic opening, some sort. But the regime, I think the main issue is that the regime in Iran mentality needs to change. And if this doesn't happen, nothing will. We're heading to. It seems that we're heading to an open conflict in the region. It's very unfortunate, but this is the way that even with this, everybody's talking to everybody in the region, but on the ground, it seems that the Iranians do not want to change any of their behavior. They do not want to make any concession, no compromises at all, and at the same time, the Israelis keep targeting the Iranians, and the Iranians uh, are they think that some of the Gulf states are the weaker as an easier target. So I expect to see an escalation in the near future.
Let me turn to Aaron now and ask you if you'd like to comment on this. I mean, Hesham is talking about possibly an open conflict. He mentioned the word open conflict. How do you see this, Aaron? And what kind of more constructive role, perhaps, can the US play in trying to contain this somehow, given the complexity?
I'm not sure the Saudis are the decisive actors here. I would think that neither Saudi Arabia nor the Emirates nor any Gulf state, by virtue of their proximity and geography, in my judgment, is destiny. Geography has more of an impact on shaping a nation's foreign policy, in my view, than any other factor. And the Gulf states are vulnerable. The Kuwaitis don't look at Iran, and the Omanis don't look at Iran the same way the Saudis or the Emiratis do, or the Bahrainis. But I think the collective perception is that these states have no intention of becoming the tip of the American or Israeli spear against Iran, particularly in view of their own assessment that the administration wants to avoid, if at all possible, an Israeli-Iranian confrontation that could evolve into more of a regional war. I agree with Hesham completely. I think the Iranian regime is driven by a profound sense of insecurity on one hand and a deep sense of entitlement on the other. It's a very serious country. And the truth is, before the Saudis and the Emirates began to emerge as key Arab actors in a region that had seen the three most traditional powers that competed for influence in the region, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, in varying ways go offline, there were three powers, the three non-Arabs, that had the capacity to project their influence and power in the region in ways that are for good or ill: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. I would argue that still remains a critically important and overlooked piece of the region of dimension. It's the three non-Arabs, and they're not going anywhere. They are functional states with reasonable amounts of domestic stability, tremendous economic potential, very astute intelligence and military organizations. One's a member of NATO, one's America's closest ally, and the third is, I don't even know how to describe it, for some countries in the world, an outlier. But at best, the JCPOA was always a management strategy. There was no end state. It was a transactional agreement, not a transformational one. And I don't see how, and I agree with Hesham completely, I don't see how you alter. It'll be management until the nature of the regime somehow is altered, and not by external means, I might add. So I think this is I think it's very fraught. I think that the administration is somehow hoping that there would be a resumption of serious negotiations after the trip, that there'd be reentry in the JCPOA. And if there isn't, then the hope for the remainder of the Biden administration's first term is that the Iranians don't push the envelope on the nuclear issue, that the Israelis maintain a certain amount of discretion and discipline in terms of their approach to containing Iranian influence, and that a whole bunch of Americans don't get killed in Iraq or Syria to avoid an explosion. But I can't do any better than that in looking for restraining forces that will somehow bring stability to this equation. I do not think it's stable. It's highly volatile.
Unfortunately, I share your assessment, Aaron, and I suspect most of our panelists do. Donna, let me turn to you I'm going to turn to you with one last question, and maybe ask each of you if you'd like, if you have any closing remarks before we end this incredibly rich but very depressing panel. Dana, let me just ask you one last question. Both Hisham and Aaron have said that a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is quite far off, under the kind of another Abrahamic Accord. But should that happen, can you maybe talk a bit about what this means for Palestinians and for the Palestinian question? And then if you want to add with a few comments, and your comment with a few comments, and then I'll turn to the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to be brief. I agree. I don't think that we're going to have kind of the spectacle of an Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia for a variety of reasons. But military and security coordination has been ramping up since before Biden's trip, and will continue to do so for a variety of reasons. But in terms of what this means for Palestinians as well as the broader region and the people in the broader region, Palestinians don't benefit from these kinds of normalization deals, as I've already said. They are sidelined in these deals. It doesn't actually address what their concerns are, and so it leaves the Israeli-Palestinian issue to fester. But I think that this is also really problematic for the people of these normalizing states. These normalization agreements have kind of domestic repercussions, I think, that we don't consider, or we think that those repercussions are going to be easy to subdue. But
will it have repercussions? Sorry, Dana, to interrupt. Will it have repercussions should something like this happen? And I also agree it's quite off the table for now. But will it have repercussions, for example, on the status of Jerusalem? Will it have other repercussions when it comes to the Palestinian?
Well, there have been already kind of, what are they called, trial balloons? They have already been kind of trial balloons in the past, where people have, so people have floated Abu Dis, not East Jerusalem, these kinds of things. So that's already been kind of explored to a lot of indignation by the Palestinians. But I do want to turn to this point about domestic politics in these states, because I think that it's really easy for us to think that because these are authoritarian states, that the publics don't matter, that we can't possibly know what they want, or they're easily subdued. But we have polling from these countries. We have polling from Saudi Arabia that shows that people oppose normalization with the state of Israel, and they don't oppose it because we have open-ended questions in these pollings. We know that they don't oppose it because they have like some axe to grind. It's because they understand that they need to resolve the Palestinian conflict first, and they cite that as their main reason, as well as racism towards Arabs. And so when countries have pursued normalization deals, in contradiction to wider public sentiment, what this has led to is increase in repression in these countries. So we saw an increase in repression in the UAE, more than as if that's even possible, but there was. And then there was increased repression in Bahrain as well. And I imagine that this is a dynamic that's going to occur in any country that pursues normalization. We've seen it in the past with Jordan, and we'll see it in the future, which means that normalization and this issue of Palestine is not just something in the realm of foreign policy or international politics, but it has an impact domestically on state-society relations in these countries and stability moving forward.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. Ahmad, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to mention three key points. I mean, when it comes to the conflict in Yemen. And let me just, use this momentum of Biden's visit and the interest giving to what's going on in Yemen. So, first of all, I think quick fixes approach is not working in Yemen. This conflict has been going on for around 8 years, and ending the conflict also need some sort of long strategy. So we need to look into consideration, to take into consideration so many damages caused by this conflict, and try to fix it. The second point is that in worst case, in the best case scenario, the conflict in Yemen needs long, discussions, and the political compromises seems to be elusive at this point. But the best case scenario can be the frozen conflict that we can get out of all these kind of discussions. And if this is the case, we need to look into how we can restore or activate some sort of local bucket of stability inside the country. I mean, today we are talking about, yeah, we are facing some sort of oil crisis in the region. What about reactivating the oil companies working in Yemen, and try to focus on the non-conflict areas inside the country and try to support the local authorities? And the last point is that we need to look at Yemen not just from the regional or security aspect, but we look at it from the perspective of Yemeni civilians. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, for these final thoughts. Hisham?
Okay, with all the depressing things that have been said, I still think that the Saudi-America relationship is the most important partnership for the kingdom, and the foundations, I think, are there for a renewed agreement with the kingdom that strengthen the relationship in the light of maybe a global recession, while at the same time respecting the kingdom's relationship with other major powers in the world. It's also true, I think, that the kingdom and the Gulf states also share political and military interests with the US and the West. And I do not think that they wish to dismantle these relations in the near future, whether at the political, economic, or even the cultural level. Many reforms in the kingdom is influenced by the American experience. But as I said, I think a blueprint or a clear plan or on the direction of the partnership, we need this. States in the region have changed, and the US should also take this into its strategic calculation when it looks at the Arab Gulf. Without this, things will deteriorate actually in this path. I hope that things go on track again, but and with a qualitative change, with a different view of the region and these states. I think major changes have happened within these states, and the US should be aware of that.
Thank you, Hisham. Aaron?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Maha, and Ahmed and Hisham and Dana, and the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. I live in a Washington bubble, and it's easy to get hermetically sealed and convinced by your own analysis. I think one of the advantages of this panel and the center and the expertise that all of you bring to it is to challenge those assumptions. I don't always agree, but it forces me, compels me to think things through with more honesty and clarity. And I think I found this 90 minutes extremely worthwhile and very valuable. So I just want to thank all of you for making that so.
Well, on that note, then let me thank you very much, all of you, Aaron, Ahmad, Hisham, and Dana, for what was an incredible conversation, depressing sometimes, but Hesham, thank you for ending it on a somewhat positive note, talking about states that have matured in the region. Clear ideas from Hesham, from Ahmad and Dana also in terms of ways forward for dealing or beginning to address some of the key challenges, not to forget local populations and domestic politics here. I think there have been some really interesting insights, and I want to thank you all for pulling this together. So until the next time, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you very
you.
much.